Welcome to Touching Animal Stories. The rain lashed against the windows of Mark Rivers' tiny apartment, matching the storm raging inside him. At 28, he'd never imagined his life would come to this. Sitting on a worn sofa, staring at a termination letter from Techno Solutions, the tech company where he'd poured his heart and soul for the past 3 years. The words gross misconduct and theft of proprietary information blurred before his exhausted eyes. Mark ran a hand through his disheveled brown hair, his fingers trembling. He hadn't stolen anything. He hadn't compromised the Aurora project, the revolutionary AI algorithm he'd helped develop for 18 months. Yet the digital evidence was damning. His login credentials had been used to download the entire codebase at 2:17 a.m. last Tuesday. The exact time security cameras showed his keycard accessing the server room. "Stupid, stupid, stupid," Mark muttered, his voice cracking. He'd stayed late that night working, then left his computer unlocked when he stepped out for coffee. He'd been so tired, so focused on meeting the deadline, that he hadn't noticed his colleague Emily Chen lingering nearby. Now, Techno Solutions CEO had personally called him into the office to deliver the news. "We have no choice but to terminate your employment immediately, Mark. The board is furious. This is worth millions." Mark had protested his innocence, but the evidence was overwhelming. HR had even presented a fabricated email chain showing Mark discussing the sale of the algorithm to a competitor. His protests had fallen on deaf ears. As he crumpled the termination letter, a soft weight settled onto his lap. Oracles, his silver-gray British shorthair, blinked up at him with large, knowing green eyes. The cat had been his constant companion since Mark rescued him from the animal shelter 2 years ago. A quiet, dignified presence in Mark's otherwise solitary life. "Hey, buddy," Mark whispered, scratching behind Oracle's ears. The cat responded with a deep, rumbling purr, pressing his head against Mark's palm. "I didn't do it, you know. I'd never betray Aurora. It was my baby." Oracle stared at him, then gently batted at the crumpled paper in Mark's hand, as if urging him to reconsider. The next morning, Mark woke to find Oracle standing on his chest, staring intently into his eyes. The cat's usual morning routine involved demanding breakfast, not this intense scrutiny. "What is it, boy?" Mark asked, sitting up. Oracles jumped down and trotted to the bedroom door, then back to Mark, repeating the motion with unusual urgency. Mark followed the cat into the living room, where Oracle stopped in front of Mark's old recliner, the one he'd inherited from his grandfather. The chair was worn but comfortable, its brown fabric showing years of use. Oracles began pawing at the side seam of the chair, then looked back at Mark with what could only be described as purpose. "You want me to look at the chair?" Mark asked, half joking. Oracles responded by sinking his claws into the fabric and pulling, creating a small tear. Startled, Mark knelt beside the chair. "Whoa, easy there. What's got into you?" The cat continued his insistent behavior, now batting at something inside the torn seam. Mark reached in and felt a small, hard object. Carefully, he pulled it out. A USB drive, its metallic blue casing gleaming in the morning light. Mark froze. He'd never seen this USB before. It wasn't his. The casing bore no company logo, just a faint scratch on one side that looked suspiciously like a fingernail mark. His heart pounding, Mark plugged the drive into his laptop. A single folder appeared. Aurora Backup. Inside was a complete copy of the Aurora project codebase, timestamped from 2:15 a.m. on the night of the alleged theft, 2 minutes before the theft supposedly occurred using his credentials. But what really caught Mark's attention was the metadata. The file showed it had been created from Emily Chen's workstation, not his own. Attached was a script that would have allowed someone to remotely access his computer and make it appear as though he'd initiated the download. Mark's hands shook as he scrolled through the evidence. This was it. The smoking gun. Emily had set him up. She'd copied the files to this USB, then used some kind of remote access tool to make it look like Mark had stolen them. But why? Mark racked his brain. Emily had always been friendly. even mentoring him when he first joined Techno Solutions. They'd worked closely on Aurora together. What possible motive could she have? Then it hit him. Last month, Emily had mentioned she was in financial trouble. Her mother's medical bills were piling up. Mark had even offered to lend her money, but she'd politely refused. Had she sold Aurora to a competitor to solve her problems? Oracles nudged Mark's hand, breaking his train of thought. The cat seemed to understand the significance of what they'd found. "You're a genius, buddy," Mark said, scooping up the cat. "But how did this USB end up in my chair?" He tried to reconstruct the timeline. The night of the alleged theft, Mark and Emily had both stayed late. They'd been working side by side in Mark's apartment, testing the algorithm on his personal computer. At one point, Emily had excused herself to take a phone call. Mark remembered now. While he was in the kitchen making coffee, Emily had been alone with his computer. She must have created this backup on the USB, then hidden it in his chair when he wasn't looking, perhaps intending to retrieve it later, but forgetting in her haste. But why leave it behind? Maybe she'd been interrupted, or perhaps she'd planned to come back for it and never got the chance. Mark's mind raced. He needed to take this to someone who would believe him. His first instinct was to contact Techno Solutions security team, but after how quickly they'd turned on him, he wasn't sure they'd give him a fair hearing. Then he remembered Detective Laura Hayes, the cybercrime specialist who'd spoken at a tech conference Mark attended last year. She'd struck him as intelligent, thorough, and genuinely interested in justice, rather than just closing cases. Mark quickly found her contact information online and drafted an email explaining his situation, attaching screenshots of the USB's contents. He emphasized that he wanted to clear his name and help catch the real culprit. To his surprise, Detective Hayes responded within the hour, requesting they meet that afternoon. The police station's cybercrime division was a far cry from Techno Solutions' sleek offices. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Mark sat in a cramped interview room, oracles in a carrier at his feet. Detective Hayes entered, a no-nonsense woman in her 40s with sharp features and observant eyes. She nodded at the carrier. "You brought your cat?" "He's the reason I have evidence," Mark explained, opening the carrier. Oracles emerged with dignity, immediately jumping onto the table and sitting primly beside Mark. Hayes raised an eyebrow but didn't comment as Mark laid out his story. She examined the USB drive carefully, then plugged it into a secure workstation. As she reviewed the files, her expression grew increasingly serious. "This is compelling," she admitted. "The metadata shows this was created from a different machine than the one used in the alleged theft. And this script, it's sophisticated. It would have allowed someone to remotely access your computer and make it appear as though you'd initiated the download." She looked up at Mark. "Why would your colleague do this?" Mark explained Emily's financial situation. "I don't think she meant to get me fired. Maybe she thought she could copy the files without anyone noticing, then return them after she got the money she needed." Hayes nodded. "It happens more often than you'd think. People rationalize stealing intellectual property when they're desperate." She turned back to her computer, running additional analyses. "I'll need to verify this evidence properly, but it certainly casts doubt on the original accusation." Oracles, who had been sitting patiently, suddenly jumped down and walked to the door, then back to Mark, repeating the motion. "Does he want out?" Hayes asked. Mark shook his head. "He's trying to tell me something. He does this when he wants me to follow him." Curious, Hayes followed Mark and Oracles into the hallway. The cat led them to the evidence storage room, stopping at the door and looking back at them. Hayes exchanged a glance with Mark. "That's unusual." She swiped her badge to enter the storage room. Oracles darted inside, heading straight for a shelf labeled Techno Solutions Case. On the shelf sat a single evidence bag containing Mark's company-issued laptop, the one that had supposedly been used to download the Aurora code. Oracles began pawing at the bag, then looked up at Mark and Hayes with unmistakable urgency. Mark's eyes widened. "The laptop! When Emily accessed my computer remotely, she would have needed to install some kind of remote access software. It should still be on there. Hayes quickly retrieved the laptop and booted it up in a secure environment. Within minutes, she found what they were looking for, a hidden application called Shadow Connect that allowed remote access and could mask the user's identity. Further investigation revealed login records showing Emily Chen accessing Mark's computer at 2:15 a.m. on the night in question, just before the files were stolen. Hayes' expression turned grim. "This is solid evidence. I'll need to bring Ms. Chen in for questioning." 2 days later, Mark sat in Techno Solutions' conference room, flanked by Detective Hayes and the company's legal team. Emily Chen sat across from him, her usual confident demeanor replaced by a pale, anxious expression. The room was tense as Hayes presented the evidence. The USB drive, the remote access software on Mark's laptop, and digital footprints tracing back to Emily's home computer. Emily tried to maintain her composure, but when Hayes played a recording of Emily's phone call that night, the one where she arranged to sell the Aurora code to a rival company for $250,000, she broke down. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," Emily sobbed. "My mother was dying, and the hospital said they'd stop treatment unless I paid $200,000 up front. I thought I could just borrow the code, sell it, and return it before anyone noticed. I never meant to get Mark fired." Mark felt a pang of sympathy despite everything. "Why didn't you tell me you were in trouble? I would have helped." Emily shook her head. "I was ashamed. And when I saw how quickly they turned on you, I thought maybe it was better this way. I didn't think you'd ever find out the truth." The CEO of Techno Solutions, a stern man named Robert Vance, looked between them. "Emily, you've compromised the security of one of our most valuable assets. You'll be facing criminal charges." He turned to Mark. "And Mark, I owe you a tremendous apology. We should have investigated more thoroughly before jumping to conclusions." Mark nodded, still processing the whirlwind of events. "I just want to get back to work on Aurora. There's still so much to do." Vance hesitated. "Actually, given what you've been through and what you've uncovered, we'd like to offer you a promotion. Head of the Aurora project, Emily's position." Mark was stunned. I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Hayes said with a small smile. "You've earned it." As the meeting concluded, Mark stepped into the hallway where Oracles waited in his carrier. The cat greeted him with a soft meow as if to say, "I told you everything would work out." "You saved my career, buddy," Mark whispered, scratching behind Oracle's ears. "How did you even know about that USB?" The answer came to him as he remembered that night. Oracles had been with them while they worked. The cat often curled up on Mark's desk while he coded. Emily must have hidden the USB in the chair while Mark was in the kitchen, and Oracles had seen the whole thing. Weeks later, Mark sat at his new desk in the corner office overlooking downtown, Oracles curled up in a sunbeam on the windowsill. The Aurora project was back on track, with Mark leading the team toward its official launch. The door opened and Detective Hayes walked in, holding a small box. "Thought you might want this back," she said, placing the box on Mark's desk. Inside was the USB drive, the one Oracles had found. "The case is closed," Hayes explained. "Emily pled guilty to computer fraud and is cooperating with authorities. She's looking at 6 months in prison, followed by probation." Mark nodded. "I heard. I wrote a character reference for her sentencing. Her mother's treatment was covered by a medical charity after the story went public." Hayes smiled. "That was good of you." She glanced at Oracles, who had opened one eye to observe the visitor. "You know, I've been thinking about your cat. I've handled hundreds of cybercrime cases, but I've never had a feline detective help solve one before." Mark chuckled. "He's full of surprises." Hayes hesitated, then asked, "Would you and Oracles be willing to consult on a case we're working on? There's a series of corporate thefts we can't quite figure out. Something tells me your cat might notice what we've missed." Mark looked at Oracles, who stretched and yawned as if considering the offer. I think he'd be honored. At Techno Solutions' annual holiday party, Mark found himself the center of attention. Colleagues congratulated him on clearing his name and taking over the Aurora project. The CEO even made a toast to the employee who proved that integrity and perseverance always win out. But the most meaningful moment came when a young intern approached him, holding a tablet. "Mr. Rivers, I wanted to show you something." On the screen was a video titled, "How a Cat Saved a Career." It had gone viral, showing security footage, with permission, of Oracle's finding the USB and leading Mark and Detective Hayes to the evidence. "Over 2 million views," the intern said. "People are calling Oracle's a hero." Mark smiled, looking down at his cat, who was currently being fawned over by half the office. Oracle's accepted the attention with regal dignity, occasionally glancing at Mark as if to say, "This is what you get for doubting me." Later that evening, as Mark and Oracle's walked home through the city streets, Mark reflected on how close he'd come to losing everything. If not for a curious cat and his insistent behavior, he might still be fighting to clear his name. "You know," Mark said to Oracle's as they reached their apartment building, "I used to think having a cat was just about having someone to come home to. But you're so much more than that. You're my partner, my guardian, my co-detective." Oracle's responded by weaving between Mark's legs, purring loudly. Inside their apartment, Mark set down his briefcase and watched as Oracle's jumped onto the windowsill, surveying his domain. The city lights twinkled below, a reminder of how much was possible in this world. Mark pulled out his laptop not for work, but to start a blog he'd been planning. Whiskers of Truth, true stories of feline detectives, would chronicle cases where cats had helped solve mysteries, big and small. As he typed the first words, Oracle settled onto his lap, his purr a steady rhythm that helped Mark focus. The cat's green eyes watched the screen with what could only be described as interest. "You're not just a pet," Mark whispered, scratching behind Oracle's ears. "You're family, and honestly, I think you might be the smartest person I know." Oracle's blinked slowly, the cat equivalent of a smile, and rested his head on Mark's arm as if to say, "I know." Months passed and Mark's blog gained a following. He and Oracle's consulted on several more cases, using the cat's keen observation skills to spot details humans missed. Oracle's became something of a local celebrity, featured in news stories about the detective cat who solves cybercrimes. One rainy afternoon, Mark received an unexpected visitor. Emily Chen, released early on good behavior. "I wanted to thank you," she said, her voice quiet, "for the character reference, for not hating me." Mark offered her a seat. "I can't say I wasn't angry at first, but I understand why you did what you did." Emily shook her head. "That's no excuse. I betrayed your trust and I hurt a lot of people. I've been working at an animal shelter since I got out. It's humbling." Mark noticed Oracle's approaching Emily cautiously. The cat sniffed her hand, then, to Mark's surprise, rubbed against her leg. Emily's eyes filled with tears. "I guess even Oracle's forgives me." Mark smiled. Cats have a way of knowing these things. Emily visited occasionally after that, always bringing treats for Oracle's. The cat seemed to understand her journey, greeting her with a quiet dignity that spoke of shared understanding. One evening, as Mark prepared a presentation for a major tech conference, Oracle's began his familiar behavior, pawing at Mark's briefcase, then looking at him with urgency. "What is it, buddy?" Mark asked, opening the briefcase. Inside, beneath his notes, was a small USB drive identical to the one that had saved him months earlier. This one was labeled Project Phoenix. Mark's blood ran cold. Was someone trying to frame him again? But Oracle's wasn't acting fearful. He was excited, almost playful. Mark plugged the drive into his computer. Instead of stolen code, he found a message from Robert Vance, the CEO. "Mark, after seeing how you and Oracle's worked together to solve the Emily Chen case, I've created a new division at Techno Solutions, Cybersecurity Animal Partners. You're hired as director with Oracle's as chief feline officer. Come by my office tomorrow to discuss. Mark laughed, scooping up oracles. Looks like we've got a new job, partner. Oracles purred contentedly, as if he'd known all along. At the official launch of the Cybersecurity Animal Partners program, Mark stood at the podium, Oracles sitting regally beside him in a miniature suit. Lots of people think cybersecurity is all about complex algorithms and firewalls, Mark began. And it is. But sometimes the most valuable security asset is right under your nose. Or, in my case, curled up on your lap. He glanced at Oracles, who blinked slowly at the audience. This cat didn't just save my career, he taught me that truth has a way of revealing itself, often in the most unexpected places. He showed me that sometimes the quiet observer sees what the focused expert misses. Mark paused, emotion catching in his throat. In a world of digital footprints and encrypted data, sometimes what we need most is a pair of eyes that sees the world differently. A perspective that isn't clouded by assumptions or biases. He looked down at Oracles. So here's to the quiet heroes among us, the ones who notice the small things, who follow their instincts, who remind us that sometimes the simplest solutions are right in front of us. The audience erupted in applause. Oracles, ever the professional, accepted the attention with characteristic calm, occasionally glancing at Mark as if to say, "You're welcome." After the event, as Mark and Oracles walked home through the quiet streets, Mark reflected on how much had changed since that rainy day when he thought his life was over. The truth had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. All it had taken was someone, something, to point it out. "You know," Mark said to Oracles as they reached their building, "I used to think I rescued you from the shelter." He scooped up the cat, meeting those intelligent green eyes. "But I think it was the other way around." Oracles responded with a soft meow and a slow blink, the highest feline compliment. As they entered their apartment, Mark knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they'd face them together. After all, truth had a way of finding its champions, sometimes in the most unexpected forms. And sometimes those champions had 4 legs and a tail.